Assessment Committee for ATP, the series on challenges in digital assessment. For those who are not familiar, ATP partnered with the International Test Commission to generate some guidelines for technology-based assessment, and those were published last fall. And since then, ATP has established a committee devoted to promoting the awareness and use of the guidelines. We support translations, updates, events around the guidelines, and a forum for sharing best practices. And today is an example of one of those forums. So the committee leadership is yours truly. I'm John Weiner. I'm joined by John Kleeman, who's the vice chair, and Pat Ward, who's the secretary of the committee. Today we have an excellent program that is featuring a section of the guidelines. So our theme here is we want to bring the guidelines to life with good examples of how to put them into practice. So today we're talking about accessibility and technology-based assessment. There's a whole chapter devoted to that. So we're delighted to have Susan Davis-Becker and Liberty Munson, who are going to share their insights on this topic. So without further ado, let me introduce Susan Davis-Becker, who is a partner with ACS Ventures. The S stands is Susan in the ACS. So welcome, Susan. I know you're going to be talking about accessibility in a changing world. So whenever you're ready to share, please feel free.
Hi, good morning. John, it says I don't have permission to share.
Okay. Well, I'll give you that. Go ahead and say a few words.
Absolutely. Okay.
While I do that.
Hi, everyone.
We'll get you going.
Susan Davis-Becker. I'm a partner in psychometrician with ACS. So little last minute change here in the lineup. So instead of maybe being the foremost expert on accessibility, I'm coming at this from a little bit of a different perspective. My perspective is one where I work with programs to design and develop their assessments. And so as a practitioner in this broader space, I can use these technology-based assessment guidelines to help guide some of those development and design conversations and say, how can we put these good practices into place for their particular program? So there's a lot of great stuff out there to read on the topic of accessibility. I'm going to condense some of this down to a very quick presentation here, and then we'll have Liberty speak more about some very cool and exciting examples of what Microsoft is doing. So we know that technology is changing everything. It's just look around our world, go to any of our conferences. It's all about technology, and it's very exciting how much we can do now thanks to technology. But with that also comes a lot of questions. And where I'm excited about as an end user of the technology-based assessment guidelines is that we have the opportunity to stop and think, if technology is changing our world, what does that mean for credentialing? And these guidelines, I think, can help us navigate some of those conversations specific to a program. One of the things we know technology is changing is how we work, right? Many of us are joining this from a home office or remote location, not a traditional office. So that's one easy way that we can see how the world is changing with technology. But there's so much more to professional practice that's come about because of technology. And so, again, means we need to, as credentialing professionals or whatever space we're working in, we need to be thinking about how do I have to change what I'm doing or what these programs are doing because of the technology that's now available in that professional space. So in thinking about this topic, I called out a couple of specific guidelines to highlight and to use as examples. I do want to note, as John said, there's a huge chapter on this. There's some great introductory text if you're new to this space to read through and get your mind kind of set in this space. Lots of great links to other more in-depth references if you want to read those. And then I think there's about 14 guidelines on accessibility. And so these are just two of them. But the two I wanted to call out were 10.2 and 10.3. 10.2 says that a testing organization should establish clear guidelines regarding which accessibility and accommodation supports are available to all test takers and which must be specified in advance for select test takers. And then 10.3 says a testing organization should establish clear definitions of the constructs targeted by the test and specify which categories of accessibility may or may not change the construct measured. At initial read of these, I first thought, okay, these are suggesting really good documentation and being very clear in your documentation, and that is an excellent recommendation. But if we take a step back and look at these from a higher level perspective, I feel the guidelines are encouraging us to be very thoughtful about these two particular areas. And being thoughtful means addressing these upfront, maybe in the design stage. So thinking about what constructs we want to target. Many of us have done a job or practice analysis where we've gone through this process. But how much have we thought about accessibility in that stage? Similarly, as we start designing what our exam will look like, are we thinking about accessibility, or do we wait till the end and start working through accommodation requests? So to me, the way I think the best use of these guidelines is to make sure we do have clear documentation, but start by having that conversation much earlier. And that leads me to thinking about universal design. And universal design, there's so much great work out there on universal design. I highly encourage you to get familiar with this concept. There's an introduction to it in the guidelines document, but there's so much more you can read if you're interested. Ultimately, universal design gets to an effort to reduce barriers. And this came from architecture, right? Where we're thinking about how do we make spaces and buildings more accessible. But we know that this now can be part of so much more of our life. How do we make our exams more accessible in general? Again, it's not about just fielding accommodation requests. It's about let's do this through the design and make this an even stronger and more accessible exam upfront. One of the references I like on universal design are the 7 elements that were outlined by Thompson, Johnstone, and Thurlow. And by looking at these 7 elements, starting with thinking about an inclusive assessment population, defining your constructs precisely. This shows you how broad the concepts of universal design can be and how many different areas we can get into with it. But you can clearly see the connection with some of these to the guidelines. Again, precisely defined constructs, that's guideline 10.3. Amenable to accommodations, number 4 here, that's guideline 10.2. So I don't have time to get all into universal design. That's a course in and of itself, but I highly, again, encourage you to check out those references and recognize that this helps at that stage, at the design stage, when you've got your subject matter experts gathered around the table. This is a great way to start having those conversations up front. So with that in mind, thinking about having the design conversations up front with accessibility in mind, we can go back to that point I made earlier about how our jobs are changing. Telehealth to me is one of the jobs that's changed so much. We used to think about medical practitioners, running from room to room, meeting with patient to patient. And you go and you say, well, I've got this pain in my wrist. Well, they're going to start maybe feeling your wrist and feeling the bones and tendons in your wrist. But now practitioners are able to do so much of that through the telehealth systems. They can interact with their patients. They can make diagnoses. It's not all areas of medicine that have moved to telehealth, but there is a significant movement in that area that's really made healthcare more accessible and made being a practitioner in that space more accessible for some. Another example is dictation software. That's existed for so many years, but it's only getting better and better. And I was speaking with someone the other day who was dealing with a temporary condition where they've lost the functionality to really type. And they said, I thought I couldn't do my job. My job requires me to produce so much text and so many, answer emails and write documents and technical reports. But then they found some great dictation software that also enables them to edit through it. And they can do, the motor functions needed to do some editing. And so they're able to do their job just in a completely different way than they used to. And they're hoping to regain that functionality through the therapy they're going through. But again, this is a changed world. And then lastly, I've got to highlight, again, the remote work, and not just the idea of working from home, but the ability to work with systems and work with networks and machines that are across the world. We can do that now through technology. We don't have to be standing next to a machine to diagnose how it's functioning or to maybe evaluate what's going right or what's going wrong. And so as we think about all these changes, we can probably reflect so much on the work we're doing or the work of those professionals that for the credentialing programs we're working with and saying, wow, how do we address this? How do we address this through accessibility design and through how can the technology-based assessment guidelines really help us here? So I want to go back to those two technology-based guidelines that I highlighted earlier. And I started thinking about, well, how, what's the best way to maybe use these in practice? And I recognize that when we're doing a lot of construct definition, construct target creation, we do talk about processing abilities, and it just kind of comes out naturally. We may not specify what we're really thinking, but it just comes out. There's a lot of different ways to describe how we think about processing, but one of the lists that I like to use is thinking these 6 that are listed here in the lower left-hand corner. We might often talk about perceptual, what can you see or visually detect, linguistic, cognitive, motoric, executive, or affective. And as we're creating those construct targets, we're probably putting some of those processing abilities in there without even realizing it, or expectations. And so as I was thinking about guideline 10.2, or I'm sorry, guideline 10.3, when we're making those clear definitions of our construct targets, we need to be really thoughtful about what is it that we're expecting. So when I work with groups, I try to say, well, we typically start with typical practice. What does typical practice look like, right? Typical practice might be your medical practitioner running from room to room. But what's possible? Well, telehealth is possible in some areas. And so we have to think about that range of the typical to the possible and to say what's necessary to demonstrate minimum competency. And I was using an example the other day of a group thinking about developing an exam where the candidates would have to write their own code, like a software code. And then as we started talking to practitioners, we learned no one writes their own code anymore. They go out to the different code libraries and search engines that they use to find example code and then start editing it. So do we need to say that someone has to be able to sit here and type out code by hand, or can we say it's rather a skill to be able to either create or identify relevant code? And then with guideline 10.2, as we're going through that design, let's think about those accessibility that we can build in. So what issues might arise? What can we address through the design? And what needs to be managed through permittable accommodations? So another example here is I was working with a program that's very graphics heavy, lots of images. And they said, oh, we need to make sure these are really high quality. So if someone needs an accommodation to be able to zoom in, to magnify, they can. And we said, well, why don't we just make them large scale for everyone? And we have magnification features on all of our software programs that are in front of us right now and on our phones. Why not make that available to everyone, since it should not be a special request? So those are just some examples of how I've used like these from a very high level design standpoint in those initial stages. But again, I encourage you to read through all the guidelines in this area because there's so much to unpack and so much great that you can probably use for your own program.
Susan, thank you. That was excellent. Are there any comments or questions? I'm monitoring the chat for you. I don't see anything at the moment. Susan, I think just real quickly, you were mentioning a real life situation where you were talking about a project. I think it was a grant project where this was coming directly into play. Do you want to take just a half a minute to mention that as an example?
Sure. So this is another project I'm working on is one where we're someone else is creating an amazing new mental health screening tool for tweens. So that's kids age like 9 to 12. Right now, the existing model is all paper pencil, kind of I'll say a little bit of an awkward form that kids are asked to fill out with their parents sitting next to them at the doctor's office. And so they're trying to create something that's really cool and technologically engaging for kids. And it's also enabled us to make it much more accessible for those kids who maybe can't. We give them a space if they want to type in answers, but if they don't feel comfortable typing, they can also speak. And the software is capturing their speech. It's not only turning it into text, but it's also looking for affect and tone, so we can try to assess their feelings and thoughts all within that. But it's a way. It's not just about if they can't type, but if they would rather just speak about it. But then some kids aren't comfortable verbalizing those things, so they would rather type it, so they feel very private about their thoughts and feelings. So this has been, the guidelines here have been really helpful in thinking through how to make this as accessible as possible for a younger generation.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great example, and appreciate it. Thank you again for the excellent overview, Susan. So next, I think we're ready to move into our second speaker, Liberty Munson. So I'm going to pass it to John Kleeman to do the introduction.
Yes, so I'm not sure Liberty will need a lot of introduction to most of you. She's the senior psychometrician at Microsoft and a long-time evangelist for inclusivity within the assessment industry. And I think let's hear from you, Liberty.
All right, I tried to share my slides. Did it work? Because I'm not seeing them in Teams. Okay,
yes.
Good. Well, that's interesting that, well, it's a feature of Teams. Every day I learn something new about Teams. So with that introduction, I won't say much more except to talk a little bit about kind of my role as we think about accessibility at Microsoft. Accessibility at Microsoft in general is a huge deal. If you think about our mission to empower every organization and every person on the planet to achieve more, by definition, we have a very inclusive mission. And when we have something that's inclusive, we must make sure that all of our technologies and solutions are accessible. So we have been on kind of this journey for a very long time to make our every experience and solution and product and service that Microsoft offers accessible. And in the last, I would say 3 or 4 years, the trend has been we won't release anything unless it's what Microsoft calls grade C compliant, which means it meets all the requirements of WCAG plus all of the other stuff that Microsoft has built in to ensure that the experience is a good, accessible experience. But when we talk about that compliance, what we call grade C, that really is just about being compliant plus just a little bit more. And you'll hear that I called it grade C because Microsoft actually has a grade B, which we're trying to get to with our exam experience. So we're already compliant with our exams, and we're trying to get to grade B, which is this idea of how you create a delightful experience. Now, if you're like me, you giggle every time you hear somebody talk about a delightful experience in the same word when somebody's talking about exams, because how can an exam be delightful? Well, that's what we're trying to do with our exams. So this just all goes back to this push to be as accessible and inclusive as possible with all of our experiences. And any new product, service, or solution we develop must be accessible before we even launch it. But as you know, we have been in the certification business for a very long time, and it was well before we had this whole idea of releasing things that are accessible. So we have been on a journey to make our exam experience accessible since 2014. That's where we actually moved. We used to be a dual EDP certification program, and we switched to a single EDP. And we took that as an opportunity to reimagine the overall exam experience. And as you can see, this has been almost a decade in the making of us getting to very close to grade B, because it's an immense undertaking to take an existing platform and make it as accessible as possible and to try to create this delightful experience. As I said, we have achieved Microsoft's minimal compliance level, which is grade C, and we're right now working on our grade B for delightful experience. So that's kind of what I want to talk to you, is this idea of how Microsoft is going beyond what we define as compliant. And so we have introduced in the last year in particular, it's kind of like this. We've been working on it so long, and then suddenly the dam broke, and we are releasing all sorts of really cool things that we are hoping will make our experience much more accessible to our learners. So one of the first things one of the more recent things, I'm not going to say first because we've been making little changes all along, but I guess let's call it one of the first big change that's happened in the last year is we introduced unscheduled breaks. Now, when you're in a test center, you can raise your hand and you can take breaks, but when you're doing online proctoring and the solution that we had, you wouldn't be able to take a break unless you requested it in advance. And as you know, that this can be tricky for people because people don't really think about it when they go to sit an exam that it's like 90 minutes. It may not occur to them that if they're doing it from home or work or whatever, they might not be able to get up and take a break if they need to. So we actually worked with ITS and Pearson VUE to build in into the system in the online proctoring a way for people to just request a break whenever they need it. And so people can leave the room, they can do whatever they want. They just need to make sure that they select, I want to take a break. And then there's a whole UI experience that makes sure that the proctor knows that they're on a break, and it lets the candidate know what to expect when they're on the break. So we have delivered a lot of the 12,000 people have taken advantage of the break feature as of September 8th. They typically only take one break, although we do see people taking more than one break. And the way I did this is I added 5 minutes to the exam time so that people could take it without worrying about creating a speeded exam experience. But it's up to them to kind of manage their time because the clock doesn't stop when they take a break. So this is kind of what the experience looks like. We have a take the break button, which looks like a pause button at the bottom of the screen there. And when they do that, they are prompted, are you sure you want to take a break? Because when you go take a break, the clock's not going to stop. You're not going to go back to any of the questions that you've seen already. So be absolutely sure that if you want to take a break, you can't go back. So make sure that's really what you mean to do. And so they even get to see how many questions that they have looked at before that they've left unanswered, so they can make an informed decision on whether it's a good idea to start their break or if they should return to the exam. And then while they're on a break, they see a screen that shows them that the exam time, their exam time is remaining, how much time is remaining. I just want to double check that you're all still seeing my screen because Teams is doing some weird stuff for me. I have some interesting features.
Yes, we can,
okay.
Liberty.
Okay, good. Great.
I can.
I'm going to just, whatever's going on with Teams on my side, I'm going to pretend is okay. All right, so that's what the unscheduled breaks are. Again, making it more accessible so people don't have to request taking a break in advance. They can just do it whenever they want. They just have to be responsible for managing their own time because I've only added 5 additional minutes. We also wanted to, one of the things we learned during the pandemic is that we felt like we probably overcorrected in terms of security when it came to the way we were thinking about online proctoring solutions. We were revoking a lot of exams for behaviors that seem to be just natural tendencies of people who may be nervous or thinking during an exam. So we worked with Pearson VUE again to come up with to create more flexibility for behaviors that were probably just normal human behaviors of things that happen during an exam when they're just nervous, like looking away from the screen or fidgeting and things like that, which previously would kind of flag the proctor. The proctor would interrupt and say, hey, look at the screen or stop fidgeting. And those interruptions are very disruptive to candidates, especially if they're like just doing things like trying to think through what the right answer might be. So what happened was because we changed the rules around what was okay during an online proctored experience, we had to create a new overlay with Pearson VUE so the proctors could know that it was a Microsoft candidate and that these things were okay. And again, this has been a very positive experience. And during the pandemic, especially early on, I was probably getting an escalation every day about somebody complaining that they did something, they were interrupted or their exam was revoked, and they felt that it was inappropriate because it was just something that they were due because that's just their human way. Their personal interaction with an exam was to look away, to look up, to think, or to fidget because they're kind of nervous. The other interesting thing about this is that a lot of the behaviors, these nervous behaviors that people have are also behaviors that some people with certain neurodiverse conditions also engage in. And so as a result, we've not only just made it more accessible for people who are nervous during the exam, but we've made it a bit less stressful for people who have some of those neurodiverse conditions that result in nervous behaviors that could come across as or perceived as cheating in other programs, but not in Microsoft's. So we have a whole new overlay for proctors that shows them it's Microsoft exam. So if their candidates are engaging in those behaviors, they're not interrupted or flagged. We also simplified the accommodation request process because, again, we're trying to make this as accessible as possible. And in talking to people with disabilities, we learned that the documentation requirement is particularly onerous for some people, especially if they haven't had the documentation demonstrating their disability updated in the last year, which is the recency of the documentation. Some of those medical reviews to get that documentation are thousands of dollars. I don't think people realize that. And so requiring that it's like prohibitively expensive for most people to get that documentation. So what we did is we actually removed the documentation for any request that would not give somebody an unfair advantage. So if somebody needs a screen reader, I'm sure there's some way people can use a screen reader to cheat. I live in a world where I'm a cynic, and I know that's true, but I think for the most part, I'm going to err on the side of, if they need a screen reader, I'm just going to give it to them, right? They don't need to give me any documentation showing why they need it. So, but for those accommodation requests where the request would result in an unfair advantage to somebody, like extra time, I am going to require documentation, but I'm going to make it I'm going to expand beyond medical documentation, and I'm going to remove the age limit of that documentation so that I simplify the process for people. So they don't have to have medical documentation. If they're getting an accommodation at work that demonstrates their need for extra time, whatever that might be, they can use that documentation from their HR that they have saying that they need that accommodation. Or if they had an accommodation, like if they're a student and they get that in school, they can use that as their evidence, their documentation to support their need. And because we changed all of this, we had to work again with Pearson VUE to update their reasonable accommodation request system, RARS, to reflect our new policies, which means Microsoft also has their new version of the accommodation request process. So we have seen accommodation requests double year over year, and this is actually a good thing for us because it was less than 1%, and we know somewhere in the ballpark of 25% of people experience some sort, when you look at significant disabilities from a physical perspective as well as neurodivergent perspective, that about 25% of the population, if not more, probably requires some form of accommodation in an exam situation. And there's other accommodations, they may not need it in an exam, but if you think about the numbers we're looking at, our best guess is probably between 20 and 25%, probably could benefit in some way from an exam accommodation given those numbers in the population. We also introduced an exam sandbox. And this should have been my first slide because this is one of the very first things we did, significant things we did in our reimagining the experience. Because one of the things I heard a lot when we about our exams is people don't do well on our first exam because they don't know what to expect. They don't know how to interact with the exam UI. They don't know what our question types are like. And you got all that nervousness going on. So working with ITS, we created an exam sandbox, which was super cool because now candidates can go in and play around with our exam UI before they actually sit the exam. Now, the initial intent for this was actually to help people who needed an accommodation understand what the experience would look like so that they would know what accommodations to request and how to interact with the UI using, if they had to use a screen reader, for example, they could practice in advance with how that would work with the UI. But it turned out it was so helpful. Beyond that, this is like one of those things where you go to create something for a particular audience, and it turns out it works like for everyone, which is why accessibility is so cool. Because if you start thinking with a broader perspective, and you thinking in a kind of this niche audience you're trying to help, and it turns out it's going to help everybody, that's not an uncommon experience when you think about creating from an accessible design perspective. The other cool thing about the exam UI is it's also localized into 12 different languages. So you don't have to speak English to be able to go and play around and get some of your anxiety lifted as it were, for what the exam experience is going to look like. So we have 50,000 launches of this a month. So I would say this is an amazing success on people trying to understand what the exam experience is going to look like. And we have asked people to leave comments. A lot of them are just leaving comments to kind of test out that feature, but the actual purpose for the comments is like, hey, look, you're in our exam UI. If you find something you don't really like or isn't accessible or isn't user-friendly, what are those things? Because we're redesigning the overall exam UI, and that kind of feedback is helpful in the way we think about our design. So this is, if you go to the website, you can see it's available in all those languages, as I mentioned. And so you can, if you're curious, go to our website and check it out. And then another big thing we just launched in August was giving people access to Microsoft Learn during our exam. This is essentially, so this to me is like amazingly cool how we were between ITS and Pearson VUE and Microsoft, how we created a solution that in a lockdown browser situation, we're allowing people to get access to Microsoft Learn, which is kind of the Microsoft Premier documentation site, and to limit them only to Microsoft Learn on the internet. So building out the solution is got to be technically complicated because it's going through a secure browser to give people access to the internet, but only to learn.microsoft.com and its subdomains. And then on top of that, I made it even more complicated because I don't want people to get access to the Q&A, because I know Microsoft Learn is moving to kind of a chatbot experience. And the last thing I need is for learners to be able to go to Q&A and just start typing in the questions on their exam and getting the bot to answer them for them. Obviously, that would be bad. And they can't access their profile. So kind of those two nuances building into, it's probably simpler to say if it's in the learn.microsoft.com domain, it's totally fine. But I'm saying, no, it can't be this part of Learn and it can't be this part of Learn, but it can be anything else. So to me, this is just like a super cool solution that I've added. And people have asked me, like, why did I do this? And part of it is because for years, I read all of the comments on our exams, and people would say, I would just look that up. And then I would go talk to my SMEs, and my SMEs would say, well, the minimally qualified candidate should just know that off the top of their head. So this is my compromise, in that I'm trying to make this a real world experience and address those people who would say, yeah, I'd go look that up. Well, go look it up. Now you have that capability, while kind of balancing with my SMEs are saying is that they need to know that, which is why I didn't add any extra time. This is just a resource on the exam. I'm not changing any of the item writing requirements because we're really still focused on real world problems people have to solve. So they can't pass the exam by looking up every question. And in fact, they won't find all the answers because of the way Microsoft designs their questions. But it does give people kind of that little comfort that they can go look something up if they need to. So it probably changes their study habits a bit. They don't have to worry about memorizing things that they might have thought they had to memorize in the past, because now they know that they can go look it up. I have actually talked to a few people about this, and they're like, this is great, but you do need to know where to go find it, which I think is perfect for this experience, because it is intended to be more of a real world experience. And because I haven't added extra time, you need to kind of know where you're going to go look to find the answer, because I think that's kind of relevant in how you would deal with it in your job. You can't spend all day looking for the answer. You kind of have to know where to go to look for it. So not surprisingly, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, except for a few people who I initially called this open book, and I have significant regrets because people have a lot of baggage associated with open book. And it's not open book in the way that you experienced open book in college or high school. It's a very different experience. And so most of the negative feedback was because they used my words open book, applied their definition, and thought that's what we were doing. Like we had removed proctors, that we were giving people unlimited time. Neither one of those are true. It's just a resource. And so now I'm talking about it more about giving people access to Microsoft online documentation. One of the really cool things about this, though, is that I have seen a lot of comments from people saying it's reduced their test anxiety, right? People are like, I may not use it, but knowing I have it available is something that kind of gives me a little bit of relief, and I feel a lot less anxious about the exam. And then we have seen it used about in 25% of our exams since we have gone live. And then just in here, some, like I said, people are pretty positive about it. Here's some social media reactions. This is mind-blowing, an absolutely great update. I love stuff like that. And then here's what it looks like. So you click on the button in Learn to access Learn, and then when you open it up, you can see that it opens in a split screen, and you can then move the cursor. You can actually switch between split screen and full screen. The splitter bar is movable, so you can change the real estate as you move through the exam. If you go into full screen, you will see what question you're on. You'll get that ability to toggle again, and you'll also see how much time is remaining. And then you can also see you can open more than one tab. You can open, I think I was looking at the data when we first did this, and somebody had opened like 300 windows, which I can't quite figure out. It's like, during the whole exam, did they just play around and learn and not answer any questions? I'm very confused by how they were able to do that, but good for them. And then if they try to access a website that is outside of what I have kind of given the candidates permission to on the Learn, within Learn, they get a notice that's saying that their access has been denied and they're automatically blocked. And then all of this leads up to reimagining the exam UI, which is what we're working on right now. And this has actually been we've been working on this for a while, for a very long time, and we've kind of doubled down on it in the last 6 to 9 months. And the conversations related to this have been really, really interesting. We've had UX designers, developers, testing experts, accessibility experts, and like everybody has had a voice in this conversation. And it's so interesting, like how much time we've spent on things that you would be like, you spent how much time on that? So one of the things that is particular, so I just want to kind of highlight this, is the clock. I would say we spent hours talking about how do we deal with the clock, the time remaining piece, right? So do we show seconds? Do we show it counting down? Because if you think about it, a lot of people, so you want to show how much time is remaining in the exam. So the question is, is time remaining, or is it time counting up, or is it counting down? And then do you show that all the time or not? Because it makes people nervous if they see the counter clock timing, counting backwards, right? And especially if it's doing it at the seconds. So we spent a lot of time talking about what we wanted that experience to look like. Did we want to use the word hours after is it 2 hours, 38 minutes and 51 seconds? Were we going to include those words? It turns out when you're localizing, that's probably a bad idea, because in German, those words are really long. And so you have to think about that too, right? So on top of the way we're going to do it in English, what does it going to look like when we localize it? So at the end of the day, we decided on a really cool feature where we're going to allow people to toggle the time remaining piece on and off, which is what that little slider bar is. If you can see on the screen, it's maybe small, but if you you'll see it a little bit more, I think a little more clearly in a few more slides. So people can toggle it on and off. And then of course you have the conversation if it's off and they're down to 5 minutes left. What do you do? What do you want that experience to be? So you're not like making people panic or like interrupting them in a way that might negatively affect their performance. So all of those, that's why this conversation took hours, but it's just so insightful when you have all these different perspectives involved in the conversation, because if it was me alone, I would have never thought of some of these things. But hearing from accessibility experts in particular about the things like to think about it for this audience, this is their experience with these types of things, and this is how we would have to redesign it. So, you can see it much, I should have went to this slide, you can see it much better. So you can toggle on and off, and that's what exam time looks like. And then we also wanted to make sure, one of the things we really struggle with is people don't know what's coming on the exam. So how many questions we're going to have, how many case studies, how many labs. And so we spent a ton of time talking about how we were going to lay that all out for the candidate and make sure that they knew what to expect. And so here's some of the things that we did kind of at a glance. So I should have probably put a slide in showing what the UI looks like today, but go to the exam sandbox and check it out. But this is a much cleaner look and feel than what we have currently today. So if you look at the exam toolbar, the expanded menu. So this is what this looks like next to the question. And so this is what it looks like when the menu is collapsed. So when you can see what it looks like when it's expanded, so you can see the question details, exam progress, and then it looks like that little toolbar on the left when it's collapsed. And then if you expand on any of these things, you can see when it's expanded on the exam details, you can see how many questions you have, how many are answered, unanswered, marked for review, marked for comment. And you can also see that by hovering over the little arrow bar, which is super cool. So you don't even have to open it. And then, like I said, we are using the exam sandbox comments to help us redesign this. And so one of the pieces of feedback is navigation is problematic. I don't know where I'm at. So if you click on exam progress, we've created the subway map so people can see exactly where they're at in the exam as they go through it. This is not hyperlinked. It's truly just a subway map, like you are here. So they know what to expect and how many questions they have, how many case studies, how many labs are coming, how many questions we have, and so on. And we've redesigned the case study. So this is what the looks like now. Another big challenge we had is people didn't know how many questions were in a case study. So that's one of the big changes we made is we have case study and then question 1 of 4 in this example. So people know what question they're on in relationship to the case, not just in relationship to their progress on the exam, but within the case itself. And then as you click on each of the different elements of the case, you get the content, and that's what it looks like when it shows up in the window. And then responsive design is huge because you have to, I think Susan mentioned this, but this idea of magnification, but people will do things like zoom their screens up to 200 and 400%. So what is the page going to look like when you do that? That is really, really important if you want the experience to be a good experience for everybody. And so Microsoft has a requirement that it has to, that we have responsive design. I want to say that everything looks good at, I want to say 400%, but it might be 200%, but it's like something like that. It's a crazy amount of a zoom in that we have to account for when it comes to responsive design and what that will look like. So to the extent possible, as much of the kind of the question appears with a limited amount of scrolling. That's kind of the key. And that gets super complicated when you start thinking about Zoom and what that looks like. And then the review screen. Here's something else we spent a lot of time talking about, and is what this is going to look like. So another challenge we have for our learners is that in certain sections, people would get to a section and they think it was the last section on the exam, and so they'd go to the review screen and they'd go back and they'd spend tons of time going back and reviewing and basically use all their time, and then they'd click next and they'd have a whole nother section. So hopefully this helps solve for some of that, is that you see it says finish section at the bottom. But what we spent a lot of time talking about was, what is the content we want to show up for the question? How many lines? Because a lot of our items start out the same way. You are in X, doing Y, right? Because that's our for the most part, our certs are job role certs. So almost all of our questions start out with some variation of, you're in this role doing this thing. And so if we just had one line of text, people aren't going to know what question that is. So we needed to, how many lines of text are we going to show? How many characters and so on? And all of that has implications for how much scrolling somebody has to do. And so you see here, this one says all. So we have categories for answered, unanswered, for review, and for comment. We also have variations of those where you could actually, this is the one that shows finish exam. Hopefully the next one shows, this is a filtered view. So this is where we spend a lot of time. If we, so do we show the for review, for comment columns if somebody wants to just see the questions that they've left unanswered, right? So do we keep all 4 of those columns? Do we even show them, or do we just show, if they said unanswered, we don't show any of the columns. We just show the items that have been unanswered. So it was, and so trying to, this is where people who really understand the different demographics we're trying to serve, especially around accessibility experts, what is the experience of people who are different from me as they think about these experiences, and what are they going to assume to be true when they see pages like this? Is it going to be, if they select unanswered, are they just expecting to see only the questions? Or are they going to want to see the questions that are unanswered, but that they've also marked for review and for comment? So those are the kinds of conversations that we have. And quite honestly, we went back and forth a lot. One week we'd say, yes, we're going to do this. And then we talk about it again the next week and like, no, I think we're going to do that, because we'd get more information and we'd think through it more and we'd make different decisions. So if you're in an unanswered cycle, let me actually go back. You see that we start with question 3. So let's say I'm in this unanswered filter view. So this is the next thing we had to talk about, is like, I'm in this view and I click on question 3, what's going to happen? And so what happens is you go to question 3. And then if you go to next, you're going to go, if you remember from that page, the next question was 6. So if I click next, I'm going to go to question 6. So you're really just cycling through the unanswered questions. And one of the things that really concerned me as we were having this conversation is, how do I get out of this, right? And so we actually didn't have this exit review mode option before. And so this was added, because what happens if somebody's in this and they decide, you know what, I'm done, how do I get out? So that's how they get back to the screen. All right. With that, I think I actually, I can't remember, John, if I'm turning it back over to you for some comments or if it's Q&A, but I'll turn it back over to you to tell us what to do.
So I think it's Q&A, and I think I'm supposed to mention some things in the guidelines that are relevant to what you're doing. But I think the truth is that you're going beyond the guidelines and perhaps doing the things that will be in the guidelines in 5 years' time. But certainly there are some good material in the guidelines about giving people practice material that your sandbox is about, and more stuff on the accessibility. There aren't any questions, and just some comments about this is amazing in the thing, and I certainly thought it was amazing. But I certainly got a question or two, and could I encourage other people to maybe either put a question in the chat or voice? But could I perhaps start with one? Did you get any pushback internally about the unscheduled breaks, as to whether they were a security risk or a challenge?
Well, no. I actually end up fighting more for them being too liberal in their approach to some of these things, and making sure that we're making the right decisions to ensure that we still have the ability to make the right interpretations based on the score. So kind of finding that right balance. My leadership team, because Microsoft is so focused on accessibility and inclusion, they really are about removing all friction. And so I struggle with that, quite honestly, because the friction in some cases is what creates the value. So finding that balance with my leadership team and working with them to understand where friction is needed and where we can maybe be a little bit more flexible has been an interesting conversation. But they actually were more pushing for me to do way more than what I've probably done so far.
Okay, and then maybe one more question from me, and then perhaps John or Pat, you might jump in, or somebody else. In fact, there is a question here from one of our audience. What is the default screen size that examinees can use for the test? Is it 13-inch laptops or smaller tablets and cell phones?
So they can use laptops, and I think that there is a minimum screen size, but I don't remember what it is. We don't allow cell phones though. But that's more of a security, and some of our item types will never work on, to be honest, on a cell phone, because we do more than multiple choice, and we have labs in some of our exams, and that just seems like I can't imagine how that would ever be a good experience on a cell phone. But Pat Ward, I know you are on the call. Do you happen to know what the screen size is for Pearson VUE?
I thought you were 1280 by 1024, but I don't know that.
I think you're right. Now that you say that, I'm pretty sure that's what it is.
Thank you, Cynthia. Good question. So a question from me. Now you've got this Microsoft Learn capability in there. Does that change how you write the items? Or did you already write the items in a way that Microsoft Learn wouldn't have helped too much?
We have written the questions already in a way that Learn is probably not going to be helpful for the majority of them. We really work with subject matter experts to create scenarios in our questions that reflect real world problems. And the only time I can see where it could be helpful is when somebody needs to go look up a particular setting that they might need to add to a virtual machine or whatever it is in Azure or what have you. And we do ask In some cases, licenses are an important part of the job role and knowing those things. And those are the two places where I see, and code, right? Because I get it a lot with code. Like, I wouldn't remember that code, especially with IntelliSense. So those are the three places where I think it would be the most helpful. And we don't have, we have code questions. So for developers, this may be more helpful. But when it comes to license, those job roles are pretty limited. And the setting stuff we tend to stay away from unless it's a really crucial for a situation. So I don't think that this is going to help people as much as they think, but it makes them feel better. And I'm totally fine with that.
John or Pat, would either of you like to ask Liberty something, or Susan indeed, or bring the conversation wider?
Well, yeah, I'd like to, I enjoy both of them because this idea of broadening the concept of accessibility to sort of everyone, in addition to making it delightful. I like, and Susan actually kind of introduced that. But for Liberty, I was just curious, when you were talking about the changes in the operational side, some of those things sound to me like they would actually reduce your costs, like support and other things. And then some things like more, doubling your applications could increase your costs. And I was just wondering overall, operationally, cost-wise, what's been the impact of the changes?
Oh, that is such a super complicated question because there's so much other stuff going on that would impact our volumes and things like that. So it's unclear to say how much of this stuff is impacting any changes in the volumes we have. What I will say from an escalation perspective, when we made the change to the online proctoring rules where we kind of, I'll just say we loosened them a little bit. And when Microsoft put that overlay saying, you know what, our candidates can do this, this, and this. Those escalations, like I haven't seen a single escalation about those issues since we did that, which during the early part of the pandemic, like I said, I was getting those escalations every day. And I'm not even the support person. It's just people know me and they send me these things. And I know that our support team was dealing with a lot of them. So we have reduced a lot of those types of support issues. When it comes to the access to Microsoft Learn, the biggest support was, when is this going to be on my exam? Because I don't want to take it until it's there. And so kind of managing that, but that's kind of petered out because it's on all of our exams and all of the languages, or it will be soon. So I actually think there might be like 2 languages left where we're still doing that. But so we don't see any more of those kinds of things. I think for the most part, especially around the accommodations and the change in the online proctoring rules, I think those support requests have gone down. But with the changes in the accommodations, the flip side of that one is that we're seeing more requests, so there's more approvals that we have to do. So I think it probably comes out to be about even, the complaints versus the approvals.
Thank you. John W.
Oh, yeah. Liberty, that was excellent. Really illustrating all the, possibilities, a lot of the possibilities for accommodation and with accessibility. I'll just point out to the listeners and watchers that, so in addition to the chapter 10, which in the guidelines is all about accessibility and fairness, there are great sections in actually the first chapter of the guidelines that deal with the design of assessments. There's a whole section on universal design, which I think Liberty was covering quite a bit, and Susan. So I'd encourage those who are here and watching on YouTube when we post it to check those out. I did have one quick question. I'll just go ahead while I have the floor. So I think this opens up so many great opportunities. I'm going to put on my measurement hat, the pointed measurement hat for all those folks in the room. So many great opportunities with data that I would imagine you have access to, or maybe you've already been looking at Liberty or plan to, but not just test score data, but you're probably getting test taker reactions and feedback, maybe ratings of some kind, and maybe even data forensic information as well. So are there plans, or are you already looking at sort of the interrelationships between performance on the tests, test taker feedback, and security?
So there, I plan to look at all of that. We're still working on how we're getting that into the data, into the payload so that I can actually get the data in an easy way rather than right now everything's in like 3 or 4 different spots. So me trying to put that all together is super complicated. But I do have plans, especially when it comes to breaks and the use of Learn. I really want to understand how those things impact some of the psychometric stuff we're seeing on the exams. I'm making some guesses. And if the pandemic taught me anything, but I don't know if people remember, but before the pandemic, I was basically saying online proctoring, that's fine. It's the same as test centers, cheating. Well, it turns out I was wrong. It turns out online proctoring, yeah, that's probably a little bit less secure. So I think that what we've done is there will be some psychometric impact and things like that with these decisions, but I don't think it's going to be detrimental to the validity of the experience. But I want to get the data and look at it and make sure that's true. And if it's not, figure out what kind of mitigations we can put in place to still create an accessible experience for people, but that maintains the validity, integrity of the process. So I don't have the data yet, but that's my goal. Yeah.
Well, that sounds great, and I think the industry would benefit from your work in that area. So I'd really encourage it. Thank you.
So thank you, John. And I think we're almost out of time now. We can just wrap it up. So maybe I'll just do something briefly, and then you. So the technology-based guidelines from the ATP and the ITC are available on the ATP and the ITC website. Ping us here, or there is the. You can either download them for free or get them printed inexpensively on Amazon. Please reach out to me or John if you've got any questions. Over to you, John.
Thank you, John. And in closing, I'll just say that, we mentioned the YouTube channel. So we had our first session, which is posted there, and this one will be posted there as well. That's the address on YouTube. One of the things we want to encourage people who are listening and watching is we are definitely interested in continuing to build out all of the use cases and case studies for using the guidelines. We know that this document, which is full of best practices, is related to practice, and we want to collect those. So if you're interested in maybe writing a blog, or getting involved in the committee itself, you can contact John Kleeman or myself at this address here. So, with that, we'd like to thank you all for attending today and watching the session. Especially thank you to Susan Davis-Becker and Liberty Munson for their excellent presentations, and wish you all a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.